You serve as a court physician in the royal household of Madrid, and the year is 1834. The king has perished, yet your duties are far from over. You've been urgently summoned to the secluded quarters of the late king, Ferdinand VII. The task awaiting you is so outlandish, so far removed from medical convention, that you momentarily doubt your grip on reality. Standing before you is Queen Regent Maria Cristina, her eyes glistening with sorrow. She delivers a request that sends a cold shiver down your spine. With hesitant steps, you draw near the deathbed of the man who haunted Spain for over 20 years, a monarch whose cruelty, suspicion, and betrayal left scars across the nation. Even in death, there's a mocking shadow in his expression, as though daring you to confront what lies beneath the elaborate covers. It's not his visage that holds your attention, but what is concealed beneath the embroidered sheets, an aberration that defined his rule as much as his politics did. Ferdinand VII possessed a grotesquely large and unusually shaped organ, a source of both secret torment and twisted vanity. As you begin the delicate process of preservation, your thoughts drift to the hushed tales whispered among palace servants, rumors of custom-made cushions, of wives reduced to sobs behind locked doors, of frantic efforts to produce an heir despite the cruel irony of nature. You're not merely preserving a body part. You're handling a symbol, an unsettling physical relic of a reign marked by distortion, excess, and ruin. Before we dive into the buried stories of pain, power, and survival from this dark chapter of history, don't forget to like and subscribe if these hidden truths captivate you. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's astonishing that across continents and centuries, we're uncovering these eerie fragments of the past together. To truly grasp Ferdinand VII, you must understand. His life was shaped not by fate alone, but by a grotesque inheritance, one that seemed destined to reflect the troubled kingdom he ruled. But Ferdinand's fate wasn't merely misfortune. It was the inevitable result of a centuries-long genetic implosion. The Spanish royal family, through the Habsburgs and later the Bourbons, had entangled themselves in a web of incestuous unions, cousins marrying cousins, uncles wedding nieces, all in the name of preserving royal blood. What they actually preserved was a lineage riddled with mental instability and grotesque physical defects. Ferdinand was not just born into royalty. He was born as a symbol of its slow rot. Delivered into the world on October 14th, 1784, at El Escorial Palace, Ferdinand was the offspring of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, first cousins whose own gene pool had already been dangerously diluted. The outcome was predictable. The genetic deck had been stacked against him for birth. But the price Ferdinand paid wasn't only in health or intellect. It was something far more intimate and far more tragic as he passed from boyhood into adolescence. Whispers began to circulate among the palace staff and medical personnel. The young prince was developing a condition so bizarre it defied anatomical logic. By the time he was a teenager, the court doctors had already coined a phrase for it: the royal deformity. His genitals were monstrously large and misshapen, more like a grotesque work of fiction than a functioning part of the human body. Hidden reports, long buried in the vaults of the Vatican, give us clinical descriptions of the horror. One physician delicately noted, "His Highness possesses a phallus of such uncommon size and strange configuration that conjugal relations may prove formidable." Another was less restrained. "The instrument resembles a billiard cue, narrow and fragile at the root, swelling to the girth of a clenched fist at its end, with a length that borders on absurdity, fit more for leaning upon than for love." This grotesque development shattered young Ferdinand's psyche. In a time when male beauty was idealized through Greco-Roman sculpture, where smaller, proportionate anatomy was the sign of nobility and refinement, Ferdinand's extreme physical trait made him a target of both curiosity and quiet revulsion. What some today might view with envy was, for him, a lifelong burden, deeply humiliating and isolating. His early years were steeped in dysfunction. His father, King Charles IV, was timid and ineffectual, preferring sport and leisure to matters of state. His mother, Maria Luisa, wielded power through scandal, brazenly parading her affair with Manuel de Godoy, who unofficially ruled Spain in her husband's shadow. As a child, Ferdinand bore witness to this degradation on a daily basis. And from it, he learned one lesson above all. Power is seized, not inherited, and it is wielded not with grace, but with fear, power, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. These were the themes that defined Ferdinand's upbringing. But it was his disturbing physical condition that most deeply carved out the man he would become. The royal palace crackled with rumors about the prince's affliction. Behind closed doors, servants stifled laughter. Nobles exchanged thinly veiled jests. Foreign envoys sent discreet dispatches home, describing Spain's strange and shameful heir. From a young age, Ferdinand came to understand that he was the punchline in a joke he didn't choose. His very body, something most people take for granted, had become an endless source of ridicule. This humiliation fermented into bitterness, a bitterness so potent it eventually seeped into his rule. The mocking eyes he imagined in every chamber, the quiet snickers behind ceremonial greetings, the carefully polite words of his tutors, all seemed to echo the same unspoken truth. He was not respected. He was ridiculed. Whether it was real or imagined didn't matter. The laughter, though sometimes subtle or unintended, was enough to twist Ferdinand's perception of the world. Even genuine gestures of respect became suspect. Every bowed head, every practiced smile from a potential bride, every diplomatic formality, he saw them not as admiration, but as mockery dressed in civility. His paranoia took root in adolescence, and it didn't go unnoticed. His instructors observed a chilling transformation. He grew withdrawn, suspicious, and increasingly cruel to those beneath him. When servants made the slightest mistake, they faced harsh consequences. What he couldn't control in his body, he sought to dominate in his surroundings. One grim episode, preserved in the writings of a palace chaplain, offers a glimpse into how twisted young Ferdinand had become. A young page, no older than 13, accidentally entered his chamber while the prince was undressing. Instead of showing mercy or dismissing the boy with a warning, Ferdinand demanded a brutal punishment. The child was whipped, and his entire family was banished from Madrid. This was no longer just a humiliated prince reacting to embarrassment. It was a ruler in the making, one who would wield power as a weapon, not as a responsibility. One who had learned to crush others the way he felt crushed by fate itself. The message Ferdinand sent to his court was unmistakable. Anyone who so much as glimpsed his secret affliction would suffer swift and merciless consequences. By the time he reached the age of betrothal, the full scope of his anatomical burden had become undeniable. Royal physicians, long suspicious of the prince's peculiar development, now faced the grim truth in full. Among them, Dr. Francisco Flores, Ferdinand's personal physician, recorded his findings in confidential writings, never meant for public eyes. His Majesty's organ, Flores wrote with clinical restraint, exhibits a configuration most uncommon. The base measures scarcely wider than a man's thumb, yet it swells rapidly into a girth that defies medical convention. In repose, it stretches nearly 10 inches, with indications of further enlargement under arousal. Its curvature is unnatural, and it bears abnormal tissue clusters of uncertain purpose, contributing nothing to reproductive function. The implications were immediate and grave. Conventional marital relations were virtually impossible. Without elaborate preparation, and perhaps the cooperation of divine mercy, conception would be unlikely, and consummation potentially dangerous. Royal artisans, under utmost secrecy, were assigned to fabricate what they tactfully referred to as instruments of intimacy, customized cushions and bracing devices designed not for pleasure, but simply to avoid injury during intercourse. Yet these mechanical accommodations only addressed the physical dilemma. The psychological toll proved far more corrosive. Ferdinand grew consumed by a need to correct or conquer his deformity. His chambers became a private laboratory of desperation. He turned to alchemists and self-proclaimed healers, charlatans, and traveling physicians who whispered promises of cures whispered in darker corners of Europe. Each claimed they could reduce, refine, or restore what nature had twisted. They brought tinctures and powders, some imported at enormous cost, others brewed in secrecy within palace walls. Ferdinand drank concoctions of pulverized rhinoceros horn, crushed pearls, and obscure jungle herbs. He swallowed gilded remedies and bathed in infusions meant to restore virility or reshape flesh. The treasury drained, but his shame remained. These bizarre concoctions were said to balance his royal essence. Some promised to reduce the size of his grotesque appendage to manageable dimensions. Others claimed they would boost his potency despite its unnatural shape. None of them worked. But Ferdinand's desperation made him a ripe target for frauds and fortune seekers. In 1802, still barely more than a boy, Ferdinand was married off to his cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The match had been arranged when they were children, and by the time she arrived in Madrid, Maria Antonia carried with her the dreamy expectations of a young bride raised on courtly tales. She'd heard whispers that Ferdinand was admired by the public, known to some as the desired one, and imagined herself stepping into a romance worthy of legend. Their wedding was a lavish spectacle, worthy of two powerful dynasties. Sacred music filled the cathedral. The streets of Madrid erupted with cheers, and the royal couple presented a flawless image, youthful, noble, and poised for a prosperous future. Maria Antonia was radiant, charming, intelligent, and eager to embrace her role. Ferdinand, under the glow of public ceremony, behaved like the perfect prince, attentive, warm, and convincingly affectionate. But all fairy tales end. The wedding feast gave way to the wedding night, and with it, reality intruded. The first alarm came not from Ferdinand himself, but from his valet. He quietly approached Maria, Antonia's ladies-in-waiting, with an odd and unsettling request. The bedchamber would require special accommodations. The women, confused, were told only that these preparations were tradition among royal couples. Soon after, an array of strange items arrived. Custom-fitted cushions, jars of aromatic salves, vials of oils, and peculiar metal instruments that resembled surgical tools more than anything amorous. Maria Antonia, raised with a strict religious upbringing, had been sheltered from the complexities of sex. Her education focused on prayer, languages, etiquette, and music, not the anatomy or expectations of conjugal life. The cryptic and clinical nature of what awaited her that night must have seemed more like a ritual sacrifice than a honeymoon. Maria Antonia's upbringing had prepared her for palace life, but not for the private realities of royal marriage. The basic mechanics of intimacy had been explained to her in vague euphemisms by elderly women who themselves barely understood the depths of what she was about to endure. When the door to the bridal suite finally closed and Ferdinand approached her in full vulnerability, her illusion of romantic matrimony collapsed in an instant. The moment she laid eyes on her husband's unclothed body, Maria Antonia reportedly descended into a full-blown panic. A lady-in-waiting, writing many years later in a discreet memoir, described the chaos. Her Majesty shrieked as if Lucifer himself had entered the room. She pressed herself against the wall, pointing and crying out, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared her sanity might never return. The object of her terror, Ferdinand's grotesquely misshapen member, was beyond anything her sheltered mind could have imagined. Witnesses later likened it to a bludgeon with a narrow base, warped and swollen in unnatural ways. It wasn't just its magnitude that frightened her. It was the curvature, the bulbous protrusions along its length, and its almost anatomical absurdity. It looked less like a part of the human body and more like something from a medical curiosity cabinet. What was meant to be a moment of shared affection quickly turned clinical. The royal physicians, discreetly standing by, were summoned to intervene. With the care of surgeons and the language of diplomats, they explained what Maria Antonia would need to endure. The infamous custom cushions were positioned. Aromatic oils and salves were applied with exacting precision. What followed resembled a medical ordeal more than a wedding consummation. Private correspondence between physicians, uncovered only decades later, paints a disturbing portrait. Ferdinand had to use specially constructed supports to bear the weight of his own anatomy, preventing serious harm during intercourse. And even with all precautions in place, the experience left Maria Antonia physically shaken and emotionally wrecked. She was reportedly administered laudanum, an opiate tincture, to soothe her nerves, a drug more commonly used for surgery than for seduction. The romantic dream of her marriage was extinguished in a single night, replaced by fear, confusion, and pain. Enduring their grim marital ritual came at a terrible emotional cost. Ferdinand, already consumed by insecurity and gnawing paranoia about his own body, became increasingly warped under the weight of his wife's barely concealed terror. Maria Antonia, on the other hand, descended into a deep psychological spiral. What we now understand as trauma manifested itself through her growing dependency on laudanum, first as a sedative for her nerves, and soon as a full-blown addiction used to dull the dread of her conjugal obligations. Their efforts to produce an heir devolved into a grim routine, a mechanical, joyless cycle orchestrated with disturbing precision. Each attempt followed a familiar pattern. Ferdinand's doctors would prepare the chamber with the necessary tools and aids. Maria Antonia, trembling with fear, would be administered a carefully measured dose of laudanum, strong enough to subdue her, but not so much as to render her unconscious. The act itself unfolded more like a cold medical procedure than an expression of intimacy. Afterwards, the pair would retreat to opposite ends of the palace, nursing physical pain and emotional wounds in silence. Year after year passed with no sign of pregnancy. Ferdinand's sense of desperation escalated into something obsessive. He became fixated on the idea that Maria Antonia's revulsion, her instinctive flinching, her tears, her tension, was somehow preventing conception. In his twisted logic, the solution was not compassion or understanding, but domination and control. He began commissioning specialized restraints to be used during their encounters, straps and bindings designed to immobilize the queen, holding her in place so that she could neither recoil nor resist. The irony was grotesque. The same royal artisans who crafted his equestrian gear and ceremonial regalia were now designing bondage equipment for the royal bedroom. Ferdinand's madness didn't stop there. His desperation bled into mysticism and superstition. He started aligning their attempts at intercourse with celestial patterns, phases of the moon, planetary alignments, and numerological calculations. Court astrologers were consulted as often as physicians. Strange men and women, drawn by rumors of the king's peculiar curse, began arriving at court offering spiritual remedies and ancient secrets. Among them was a self-proclaimed mystic from the East, a wandering figure wrapped in silk and mystery, who claimed to possess esoteric knowledge capable of lifting any curse of infertility. He promised results, not through medicine or prayer, but through arcane rituals involving incense, chants, and symbolic offerings. The palace, once a symbol of regal order, transformed into a stage for bizarre ceremonies and occult experiments. What unfolded behind the palace walls was less a love story and more a haunting chronicle of power, humiliation, and suffering, driven by a deformity no one dared name aloud, and a legacy of royal dysfunction too grotesque to be forgotten. The so-called wise man, cloaked in mystique and Eastern philosophy, offered Ferdinand not just hope, but divine purpose. He told the troubled king that the peculiar shape of his anatomy was not a curse, but a mark of celestial favor. It was, he claimed, the legendary rod of the dragon, a symbol of virility and power in forgotten dynasties. According to the mystic, all Ferdinand needed to unlock its full fertility was a strict regimen of rituals derived from ancient Chinese scrolls. For 3 months, the palace became host to surreal and esoteric ceremonies. Incense thickened the halls with pungent smoke. Chanting echoed through private chambers. The king and queen were instructed to perform elaborate couplings in precise positions, timed with lunar cycles and planetary alignments. The bizarre spectacle, kept hidden from the public, blurred the line between mysticism and madness. Then, the impossible happened. Twice, Maria Antonia conceived. Joy swept through the royal court like wildfire. Bells rang, emissaries were dispatched, and Ferdinand, swelling with renewed pride, walked the palace with his head high, convinced that his so-called divine rod had proven the doubters wrong. Spain dared to hope again, preparing for the birth of a long-awaited heir. But joy turned to ash. The first miscarriage, in early 1804, occurred during the 4th month. Official statements cited delicate health and natural causes, but in private, physicians whispered a darker truth. Maria Antonia's body had been pushed beyond its limits. The repeated trauma of her conjugal duties, exacerbated by the king's deformity and the unnatural rituals, had likely caused her body to reject the pregnancy. The second miscarriage, in 1805, was worse. Maria Antonia carried this child nearly to term. Hushed optimism filled the palace as her belly grew, and for a brief moment, the royal couple seemed almost reconciled. But when labor began, it unfolded as a nightmare. The delivery was long, excruciating, and violent. The child was lost, and Maria Antonia herself came within moments of death. She survived, but barely. The experience broke her. She never truly recovered, either physically or mentally. Her reliance on laudanum escalated until she drifted through her days in a haze of pain and opium. The lively, educated young queen was now little more than a shadow, silent, pale, and detached from the world around her. Ferdinand's response revealed the rot at the heart of his character. Where empathy was needed, he offered suspicion. Instead of comforting his wife, he accused her. In his paranoid mind, the miscarriages weren't misfortunes. They were acts of sabotage. He whispered to confidants that she had secretly taken herbal tonics to induce the losses, that she might be colluding with liberal factions to prevent the birth of a royal heir, or even that she had allowed demons into her body through disobedience and pride. These accusations, repeated and reinforced by the echo chamber of a superstitious court, devastated Maria Antonia's remaining sanity. Already weakened and racked with guilt, she came to believe that she was indeed cursed, that her womb rejected life as punishment for some undefined sin. She retreated into obsessive prayer, spending hours on her knees whispering desperate pleas for forgiveness, unable to name the crime she believed she had committed. Her final years were marked by isolation, addiction, and a slow spiritual collapse. To the world, she was still queen. But within the walls of the palace, Maria Antonia was a prisoner of fear, pain, and the tragic consequences of a marriage built on bloodlines and deformity. Unusual solutions to the problem of the king's anatomy, the royal medical wing became a theater of grotesque innovation. Royal physicians, desperate to preserve their reputations and maintain royal favor, began exploring an unsettling array of treatments. Among them were mechanical braces designed to redirect the curvature of Ferdinand's member, crude prototypes of what today might resemble orthopedic sexual devices. These contraptions, often made of leather, ivory, and silver, were equal parts instrument and torture device. One physician proposed a regimen of hot wax molding, attempting to reshape the king's appendage over time. Another imported electric stimulators from France, recently invented and untested, believing controlled shocks might train the tissue into more functional behavior. Most of these methods were not only painful and ineffective, they bordered on the inhumane. Yet Ferdinand endured them, obsessed with the idea that his virility could be normalized, if not spiritually, then scientifically. All the while, the public face of the monarchy remained polished and proper. Black crepe adorned the palace gates. Memorials were held. Songs were sung in honor of the dead queen. But within the stone walls of Madrid's royal residence, the reality was far from solemn mourning. Ferdinand, ever theatrical in his grief, played the role of the heartbroken widower before foreign dignitaries and nobles. Yet behind closed doors, he studied portraits of eligible noblewomen, scanning court reports for proof of strong childbearing hips and clean family lines, that he was determined that his next wife would be different. She would not recoil. She would not scream. She would be prepared. The apothecary's mysterious death only deepened the shadow around Maria Antonia's final days. His sealed room, the strange stench of crushed herbs and bitter root, and the destroyed remnants of laboratory notes hinted at secrets that would never come to light. Whispers filled the court, that he had been silenced, that his formulas were confiscated and hidden deep in the palace archives. What little the public knew came from servants' gossip and the fleeting accounts of visiting nobles. Even those were swiftly suppressed. Yet the question lingered. Had Maria Antonia been driven to death by sorrow, or helped along by the very man she called husband? Ferdinand never answered. He didn't need to. His actions said enough. The Ferdinandinos had crafted a symbol, not a man. To the public, Ferdinand was a savior. To those closest to him, he was becoming a tyrant in waiting. Behind the scenes, the so-called sophisticated marital aids commissioned for his first wife were being redesigned and refined with the help of foreign inventors and rogue surgeons. Some devices resembled primitive scaffolding, meant to lift and align his malformed anatomy. Others were padded implements to cushion the impact during intercourse. A few included mechanisms that mimicked modern-day prosthetics, straps, rods, and hinges, absurd in their ambition and grotesque in execution. There was even a quiet attempt at surgical correction by a French physician trained under the revolutionary new anatomical reconstruction theories. But the results were inconclusive, if not outright disastrous. A.S.'s second marriage loomed. The physicians were under orders to perfect these interventions, or face disgrace. Meanwhile, Ferdinand himself grew more erratic, demanding daily reports on astrological forecasts, fertility calendars, and increasingly obscure religious rites that promised purification of the royal seed. He believed, deeply, irrationally, that divine forces had sabotaged his first marriage and that only total control of his environment could prevent future failure. Control, in fact, had become his obsession, and no longer satisfied with punishing disobedience quietly, Ferdinand began to make examples of those who crossed him. One footman who joked about the royal hammer vanished, only for his body to be found weeks later floating in the Manzanares River, with his tongue removed. A young court musician who composed a satirical tune mocking the strange silences of the royal bedroom was arrested for treason and died in prison under mysterious circumstances. Even senior courtiers whispered with caution, afraid that any slip of the tongue could find them blacklisted, or worse, be why the time Ferdinand finally ascended the throne in 1808, briefly, during the chaotic Napoleonic invasion. The man who once appeared as a symbol of patriotic hope had already become a creature of shadows. While the people still cried, "Viva Fernando!" his inner circle knew the truth. Their king was ruled not by vision, but by a deep and insatiable insecurity rooted in his own flesh.